Bonjour à tous et bienvenue pour cette nouvelle vidéo de Permaculture Design. La forêt, c'est un des biotopes ou des milieux naturels des plus productifs et des plus résilients qui soient. Qui est-ce qui arrose une forêt? Qui apporte de l'engrais à une forêt? Personne. Est-ce qu'elle subit des maladies qui la détruisent entièrement? Non. Alors ce stade forestier, eh bien, c'est donc un des modèles que la nature nous présente et dont on doit s'inspirer pour réaliser nos systèmes nourriciers. Alors des pionniers ont compris cela il y a de nombreuses années, dont Martin Crawford qui a créé chez lui un véritable système nourricier basé sur la forêt, ce que l'on appelle un petit peu plus communément une forêt comestible. Alors Walter Carrier, qui est de la pépinière Atmosphère, eh bien s'est rendu récemment chez Martin et il a le plaisir de partager avec nous eh bien, une interview de Martin où il nous parle eh bien, de son aventure. Je vous laisse regarder tout ça.
Thank you, Martin, for having me for an interview. I prepared you some questions. Martin Crawford, one of the pioneers of forest gardening in Europe, or in the UK, and for sure in Europe also. My first question to you would be, what made you decide to invest your life in agroforestry and forest gardens?
The decision to do that really came about because before I was doing this, I was running an organic market garden with my wife, growing annual vegetables, selling annual vegetables here in South Devon, and market gardening, organic market gardening we could do, we could do it reasonably well, but a lot of organic market gardening is very tedious work. There's a lot of endless hoeing, weeding, and I started to question the sustainability really of growing so many annuals, and thinking, are there different ways to grow? Can we grow more perennial foods? At the same time as thinking that, I discovered what a man called Robert Hart was doing in this country, and he had started experimenting with a forest garden, and he wrote about it. So I went and visited him to see what he was doing, and he inspired me that actually agroforestry systems based on mostly perennial plants, trees and shrubs and smaller perennials as well, could be much more sustainable systems of growing food or other products, but also could be very beautiful places to be in and to work in. So in many ways, better for the soul, if you like, than endlessly growing annual vegetables in long lines. I guess it was a process over a couple of years really, of a complete change in outlook, really, and really just understanding really ecology, and what the real world is about, and it's not about growing annuals. Nearly everything that grows in nature is perennial, and actually nature can do a lot of work for us. So in a forest garden type system, a lot of the work is done for us. We have to do much less ourselves, so it's better all round in many ways.
Can you explain to us how you thought about the harvesting in a forest system?
Yes, I mean the harvesting for me has to be pretty efficient, because I'm a fairly busy person. I have lots of different things that I do, which looking after the forest garden is just one. For me, harvesting, there's a lot of, normally there's a lot of fruit trees in forest gardens. So harvesting fruits, for example, needs to be efficient for me. It means very often if they're small fruited trees, I'll usually try and shake those off the trees when they're ripe, put down a sheet or a tarpaulin on the ground to collect the fruits, and so knowing that that's going to happen in advance affects obviously what you plant underneath the trees. If you've got to put something down flat. You don't want too many big shrubs interrupting, laying or taking up of things like sheets. Smaller fruits, off bushes and so on. It turns out, there are very efficient little hand tools to help with harvesting, like berry pickers from Scandinavia that are actually fantastic for a lot of small fruits. So there are actually, a lot of very efficient ways to harvest.
Would you advise this system as a high productive agricultural system?
It depends what you mean by high productive. Now, to some people, high productive is obvious. The meaning is obvious. But actually, if you look at agricultural systems, it's never enough just to look at output, which is what most agricultural economists do. They just look at output. But you have to look at output and inputs and relate them in some way. Because conventional modern agriculture can be very productive in terms of output. So, a field of wheat grown with every chemical under the sun can yield a big weight of wheat in the end. But the energy you've put in to grow that in terms of making all the chemicals, making all the tractors that do all the work all the time is huge. And so, in terms of productivity, yes, forest gardens can be very productive places. You can think of them in some ways as, if you think of a fruit orchard, and you underplant and you overplant. So you plant some things that go up above the trees and some things underneath. So you add to the productivity of an orchard. Now, an orchard is a productive place. Everybody knows an orchard is a productive place because there's lots of fruit trees with lots of fruits on. So if you think of a forest garden as an orchard plus, plus some stuff growing above, plus stuff growing underneath, that's also all useful, either edible or useful to the system in some way. It's very easy to recognise then that forest gardens can be very productive places, but they're also very low input. So, by some measures, they're much more productive than annual agriculture. That doesn't mean to say you get more out of them per square metre necessarily, but they can be very productive.
Thank you. And one last question: we in farms and hobbyists and professionals, we all are selecting fruit trees and cropping trees by grafting or at the basis of taste or caliber. Do you see any changing in the resistance of fruits and the selection and climate change? And what would be your advice as for us to the choice of cultivars?
Yeah, that's a tricky subject. Because in many parts of the world, what's going to happen with climate change is relatively obvious. Temperatures are going to climb, and certainly in Central Europe, that seems pretty likely to happen. In Britain, it's a little bit different because we have the Gulf Stream and ice melting from Greenland, and all sorts of things can interact. So it's a bit unsure what will happen in this country. But generally, first, diversity is important, because although temperatures may rise gradually, it's not so much that can damage plants. It's the increase in weather extremes, so floods or droughts, for example, and it's the increase in, or the arrival of pests and diseases that you haven't had before, because all those pests and diseases, their ranges are moving with climate. They're moving north and they're gradually moving east through Europe. And so pests or diseases you haven't had yet might arrive. So diversity is the most important thing. Have as many different species and as many different varieties as your system can have. Obviously there's a limit there, but diversity is very important. What we should be looking at in terms of specific varieties, for a specific type of fruit, is don't necessarily think that what has worked well locally, traditionally, is the best thing. It may not be anymore. Maybe you should be looking further south. The climate in Britain has moved equivalent to about 250 kilometres southwards. And it's the same in other countries. The figures may be slightly different, but it's, you know, it's as if we're all moving southwards, we're all floating southwards. So certainly look further south. Look at what's grown in regions further south from you, and try and incorporate some of those varieties maybe in what you do. Don't, you know, never put your eggs all in one basket, is something I like to say, you know, because there's a lot of unknowns and so on. But certainly look further south. Some trees, obviously, fruit trees can be regrafted in time. You know, if in 20 years' time it's got noticeably warmer and some varieties are failing, you know, obviously it's relatively easy to regraft some types of tree with varieties from further south, but that can only go on so long. In Britain, we're losing 1% of our winter chilling hours every year. So chilling hours is something lots of fruit trees need to flower properly the following spring, and if they don't get enough, they will stop performing very well. So gradually, you know, lots of varieties will get less and less productive if temperatures keep rising and winters keep getting warmer. You know, I have no magic solutions for this, apart from look further south and diversity, really.
Thank you, Martin Crawford, Permaculture Design France. Thanks you.
Thank you.
Encore merci à Walter pour donc cette interview dont vous retrouverez les coordonnées de la pépinière exactement sous cette vidéo. La plupart des systèmes de forêts comestibles sont construits à base de guildes, donc de végétaux pérennes qui s'accordent et se soutiennent mutuellement. Si vous voulez en savoir plus sur ces guildes, vous pouvez retrouver les vidéos pédagogiques que le bureau d'études Permaculture Design et la pépinière Atmosphère ont créées pour vous. Toujours dans le descriptif de cette vidéo, vous avez les liens qui vous sont présentés. Voilà, je vous dis à bientôt pour une prochaine vidéo de Permaculture Design. Salut!